So the story of me finding my grandpa's parents. My grandpa Pete Story was adopted in 1932 and was brought up from California to Montana. All kind of started with some me finding out that he was adopted later in my life, and eventually kind of like progressing to there was only like one form, but he never wanted to know his parents, and then the questions if his parents could be found and did anybody else want to try to find them. My aunt married one of my Czech uncles who was big into DNA. And when 23andMe came out, they were doing some things to figure out how we were connected. And it turns out that my grandpa wasn't connected to the original stories. And the stories were like a pretty local, famous family out in Montana. They had some statues. When I grew up, I felt entitled and privileged and proud of my family because of these big names. My great 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 grandpa did some crazy western story things. He has a statue in Bozeman, Montana, riding on a horse. And then Thomas Byron, his son, who I'm named after, did some good things. And then Malcolm, his son, has a statue also in Bozeman, Montana, and also was well known through his lifetime growing up in Montana. There's a Nelson Story Tower, Nelson Story Avenue. There's quite a few things, enough that it was like it made me proud to be a story growing up for sure, just based in my family name. But then as I got older and we started to talk about identity in my job as a teacher, I started to think about how my own identity was shaped by my family name, and and feeling that I was based in blood of the Story family name. And so um, around 2020, I started to um, start to think about, wait, how could I use DNA to figure out if I could find my grandpa? And so I still had three grandparents that were still living. I had my grandma Tina on my mom's side, my Papa Dave on my mom's side, and I had my grandma on my father's side. So my grandfather, Pete Story, had passed away around 2005. He had gotten in a car accident. It had knocked some years off of his life quite significantly, and he ended up having a stroke a couple years after his accident. And so I did not have his DNA. And maybe, you know, who knows, he might not have wanted to do a DNA test to even kind of find out either. So, because he had never had any interest about finding out who his parents were. If he had always kind of, there's a lot of rumors in families. So one of the rumors was that if he thought if his parents had ever wanted to find out, they would have found him by now. And then he knew he was loved by like his father and his mother, his adopted parents. So it was never a thought. Another interesting part of the story was that he wasn't even told he was adopted until he was around 25 years old. He had already gone to Culver Military Academy. He was in the Navy. Um, I found out a lot through my Ancestry searches that like a lot of this paperwork in the old days was faked or forged or changed, or somebody wrote the name wrong down in some sort of registry, and then it just got changed in history that way. And sometimes people took those names on further down in their lives. But so I didn't really trust even some of the paperwork, because it seems like my grandparents had lied about the paperwork for years and years too. So how could that paperwork be trusted? And um, so I asked my three grandparents. One had already done a DNA test through Ancestry, um, and so that was my grandma Tina. And so so I just had to get the other two, and so I sent a DNA kit to my grandma Mimi on my dad's side, and I sent a DNA kit to my grandpa on my mother's side. And with my grandpa, I was like, hey, when you spit in this thing, it better not just come back like Copenhagen and Coors Light. So I better have a DNA test. That was like a joke. And so they were willing. My grandma on my dad's side, Mimi, she had already done a DNA test with 23andMe, again, some years before, through my aunt, and she was 99% Irish. She had the most boring DNA results I had ever seen. It was just this one green bar all the way across. You're from Ireland, and with a 0.1% of, of the African or Asian descendant, that she had. And, and her DNA test had told her that, you know, she had slow earwax and that she shouldn't be a marathon runner, so it was kind of like a funny, really boring DNA test. And so I did my DNA test. She did hers through Ancestry. My grandpa did his. And so then this, it took about a month and a half, and all the data started to come in about who was connected to who. And again, this was 2020, so Ancestry didn't have all the details yet. They didn't have paternal and maternal lines yet. They didn't know what side was coming from dad. They weren't saying those results, who was a dad or who was on the mom side yet. But they had, centimorgans, and they had, their matches to who they thought was who. So they're like, yep, here's your grandparents. Dave Ekstrom's on your on your mom's side. Christine Clark's on your mom's side. Eileen Kavanagh on your dad's side. And then so what that allowed me to do is, at the beginning, I was like, wow, I could have the 3 grandparents, and then who's ever not connected to me, or who's not connected to these grandparents, will be like my grandpa's side, and it'll be so easy to figure out who they came from. And that was so far from what I had to overcome over the next couple of years. But to start, you could go into Ancestry and you could click on one of your relatives' names or matches names, and then find out how you're connected to them in a way. So, or who are shared matches. So I could click on Eileen's story, my Mimi, and it would show all the matches that we have together. And so I would go and click all of them. So I click all the ones that were shared between her and I would label them green, her being Irish, and just click it and green, 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 green. So there might have been 300 or 400 matches that I was able to click as shared matches and put them in a group, Kavanagh. Then I did the same with my grandma on my mom's side. She was a Clark. I click shared matches. I go through all the Clarks, a lot of English, Scotland, and just click, blue, 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 all the way down. So, and the Clarks were very prolific, and they had like probably 800 matches. It just kept going. So eventually, I selected all of them and put them in a group, and then went to my grandpa, Dave Ekstrom, who was Swedish, and was able to say shared matches, and then go through and then just go down through the Ekstroms and the Gustafsons and everybody else, and the Dolls and all the people that had Ancestry DNA on, that were, from half second cousins to, sixth matches, and mark them all yellow. And then I had a group of people that weren't connected to those 3 living grandparents. And so I had to kind of assume that they were connected to my grandpa, Peter Story. So I started to label them and put them in a group called Peter Reynolds Story. Now, in hindsight, my big problem was that big group, I thought I could figure out who the grandparents were. I could find some names of some people. Was really difficult because I didn't have first cousins and second cousins at that time. I didn't have close matches where I could try to find some names that could be. The second part that I didn't think about is all of those matches, up through fourth and sixth cousins, could have been my grandpa's mother's side, and they could have been his father's side. So I didn't really know where that group was going to happen. The only clue that I had going into this at the very beginning was one piece of paperwork that was from the California adoption papers. It wasn't a birth certificate. It was just the day that he was adopted, and it had the mother's name typed onto this document, December 25th, 1932. And the name of the mom was Anne Scheppe, Anne, Scheppe, Scheppe. That was it. And it said, by the account of the mother in the state of California, the dad wasn't needed to sign off on this document. She's giving up, her rights as a parent to who would be Malcolm Story and Rose Story, my great grandparents, Peter's adopted parents. And that was the only clue that I had. So I had Anne Scheppe.